All right, welcome back. I hope you were able to make some cool creations with the primitive objects. If you followed along with the demo, it should be clear that with enough time and patience, you can make some pretty cool stuff even with just these limited functions. But I'm sure you're thinking, yeah, this is great, but not every object in the world is just a box or a sphere. What about organic forms like characters? And you're right. We need to learn how to edit these primitives into more. Before we get started editing these meshes, however, I do need to briefly explain something about shading modes. If we hold Z on our keyboard, we will bring up this radial shading menu. Shading modes in Blender allow you to view your model with different levels of information. So, by default, a new Blender file will be in the solid shading mode. This will render your objects with these opaque gray faces, which by now should be very familiar to you. However, if we hold Z and select wireframe mode, now we are viewing these objects as wireframe meshes that we can see through. If we hold Z and select material preview, this will show you the materials and textures applied to your models should you have any. These models are being rendered in solid white because we currently do not have any materials applied to them. Holding Z and pressing rendered will bring you into rendered mode. Rendered mode shows you your solid objects plus their materials plus any lighting information you may have in the scene. Remember that Blender default scenes start with a light object in them, and this is for viewing things in rendered mode. We will discuss these shading modes in more detail in future videos, but we just needed to be a little bit familiar with them in order to proceed to the next section. For the time being, we are only going to be looking at solid and wireframe modes. Okay, with that out of the way, we can get into mesh editing. Open up a new Blender file if you don't have one open already. We're going to use a sphere now because I think this will be easier to understand on a sphere. So we're going to select all the objects in our scene by pressing A. We're going to delete them by either pressing delete or by pressing X and then confirming delete. We are now going to add a sphere to our scene by pressing Shift and A, Mesh, UV Sphere. Now, up until this point, we have only been working with meshes in what is called object mode. Object mode is used for selecting and manipulating entire objects like we have been doing so far. But we can edit these primitives at a finer level by manipulating the component parts that make up these mesh objects. Now, a mesh object is made of vertices, edges, and faces. And if you select this object by left-clicking on it and pressing Tab, I can better demonstrate what I mean. Pressing Tab will bring you into what is called Edit Mode. Edit Mode will allow you to go into an individual object and edit its vertices, edges, and faces. While we are in edit mode for a particular object, we are only going to be able to edit that object. So, say I have a few objects in this scene. I'm going to duplicate this sphere, Shift D, X to move it along the X, Shift D, X, move it along the X. So now we have a few objects in our scene. Now if we select this original one and press Tab to go into edit mode, you'll see that only this one has changed. And if we click on these additional spheres, we cannot do anything with them. In order to edit these other objects, we would have to tab out of edit mode into object mode, select the sphere we wish to edit, tab back into edit mode, and now we can select points on this object. You can also switch between object and edit mode by selecting the object, coming up to the toolbar here, drop down, selecting edit mode, and selecting object mode again to tab back into object mode. Now this drop down will give you all of the modes currently available to you based on your selection, but we are only going to be concerned with object and edit mode. So let's select this sphere and go back into edit mode to take a closer look at it. Now, in order to edit this mesh, we need to understand a little bit more about how it is constructed. As I said before, every mesh object is made up of vertices, edges, and faces. So each of these dots here is called a vertex. And all a vertex is a location in 3D space that is defined by coordinate values on the X, Y, Z grid. Left click on any vertex to select it, and you can press N to pull up the sidebar. This will allow you to view its location numerically. So if I select this vertex, it will show me that this vertex has a location of approximately 0.69 meters on the X direction, 0.46 meters in the Y direction, and 0.55 meters in the Z direction. These numbers, when paired together, are just describing this exact point in space. Now, remember that the world origin is this point here at which all these lines converge, and its numerical value is 0, 0, 0. And as a quick side note, the 3-number coordinate values are always read in the order of first X, then Y, then Z. So, if something on a 3D grid has a location of 2, 8, 14, that means that it is 2 units on this grid away from the X location. I'm sorry, I should say it is 2 units away from the world origin along this X location, 2 of these grid lines. It is 8 units away, 8 of these grid lines away from the world origin in the Y location. And it is 14 units away from the world origin in the Z direction, which describes this location in space. Now, I know I might be being sort of repetitive here, but it is really essential that you understand how 3D graphs and plotting things on a grid work. It's sort of the basis for the entire concept of 3D modeling, so I apologize if this all seems really obvious, but for some of you it may have been a long time since you took any sort of algebra or math class, so I really just want to make sure that this is clear. And even after all of this, if it's still not really clear to you why these numbers are what they are and how these axes work and so on, then I suggest you just take maybe an hour or so to brush up on some basic algebra and review the Cartesian coordinate system. So, don't worry about following along with what I'm about to do. But just to describe what a mesh is to you, a mesh is essentially a set of vertices who, when plotted on this three-dimensional grid, form all these points that make up the shape of, in this case, a sphere. So, with the information of all these individual points, Blender is able to draw lines between them called edges, and this will form the mesh that makes up our object. We can view the wireframe easily, again, by pressing Z on the keyboard and selecting wireframe, or selecting wireframe icon at the top. So now we are seeing all the vertices and the edges that make up this shape, as well as the vertices and the edges around the backside that are normally obscured by faces. Faces are these surfaces that Blender draws between areas of 3 or more edges that are rendered opaque and give the object its solid appearance. We can select vertices, edges, and faces by changing our selection mode. Now we can do this by coming up to the upper left-hand corner next to our mode selection. These icons here denote your selection mode. Right now, we have this one with the dot highlighted to show that we are in vertex select mode. This means that when I left click on this sphere, it will select a single vertex. We can select multiple vertices at the same time, the same way we select multiple objects, by selecting one vertex, then holding Shift and selecting another. You'll notice that if you select two vertices that are next to each other, it will also highlight the edge between them. This is because an edge is defined by these two vertices. And if you think about it, it is physically impossible to move either of these 2 points in space without affecting the straight line that is between them. If you are in box select mode, which you can make sure of by making sure that this selection tool has a box around it, if it does not, you can hold it, select box, or you can toggle through all the selection nodes by pressing W on your keyboard. So in box select mode, if you click and drag out a selection, it will select all the vertices within that area. Now selecting the line icon here will put you in edge select mode. You can see when I click over, all the dots have disappeared from our mesh. This is because we are no longer working with single points in space, and instead we are going to select entire edges when we click. We can hold Shift and select multiple, and we can drag out a box selection the same way we did with vertices. Now the last mode is face select mode, shown with this square icon. Same principle. When we click, we select an entire face, which is made up of the edges and the vertices. We can Shift and click to select multiple. We can drag out a box selection and select everything under the area. Now, the reason why I brought up shading view modes at the top of this video is that your selections will be affected by what mode you are in. So while you're in solid mode, if you drag out a box selection, you'll see that these faces on the front side of this mesh have been selected. But if we rotate around, nothing else has. However, if we are in wireframe view, which again we can get to by holding Z and selecting wireframe, if we drag out a box selection now, and then hold Z and return to solid view, we can see that these faces on the front have been selected, but it is also selected through our mesh to the faces on the back side as well. We've discussed quite a bit now about how to select portions of our object in edit mode, but there are a few shortcuts for selection that will immensely speed up your workflow. Let's go over some of these quickly. When modeling, there will constantly be times when you want to select all the vertices or edges in a loop, such as these loops that go around the sphere horizontally. Now, it would be awfully painful to have to come in here and click, hold shift, click, and shift click our way all the way around the mesh. So instead, we can use the Loop Select tool. Loop Select tool works in all selection modes, vertex, edges, and faces. And to use it, all you have to do is hover over the edges you want to select of the loop, hold Alt, and then click on the edge. This will highlight completely around the model. Again, we can do this in edge mode and in face mode. And in face mode. You'll notice when in face mode especially that depending on where you click, Blender will select the loop either horizontally or vertically around the model. So in face mode, clicking more towards these vertical edges on the left and right side of this single face will tell Blender to select horizontally. Clicking along these horizontal edges that run at the top and bottom of the face will tell Blender that you want to select vertically. When selecting these vertical loops on the sphere, you'll notice that it doesn't go all the way around. It stops one face short of the topmost point of the sphere. This is because the face loop select function can only select loops of quadrilateral faces, that is to say, faces with 4 sides. If you hold Alt and click on a face with 4 sides that is connected to other faces with 4 sides, Blender will be able to detect them as a loop. However, these faces at the top and bottom of the sphere are triangles. They only have 3 sides. So Blender stops the loop selection because it has detected a side, or a face, I should say, with something other than 4 sides. Now, loop select both in edge and in face mode. You can use them with the multi-select function. You just hold Alt, you hold Shift after you make that first selection, and you select again, and continue holding Alt and Shift for each selection you wish to make. Now, not everything you need to select is going to be in a straight line with quadrilateral faces. Suppose we need to select all the edges along this surface in an S pattern. Well, we could just click to select and hold Shift and begin selecting everything we need along that curve. This is somewhat tedious. So instead, to speed this up, we are going to use the shortest path selection tool. The shortest path select works by first making a selection, either a vertex, an edge, or a face. This will work in all modes. Then holding Control, and then clicking on another point on the model. So if I click here, Blender will detect the fewest number of edges between those points because I am in edge select mode, and it will select everything along that path it finds. So we could select our edge, hold Control, select this point, and then without letting go of Control, continuing to select these points until we have our S shape. Or, for instance, if we go into top orthographic view by pressing 7, let's say we wanted to select half of these triangles that make up this topmost circle. Well, in face select mode, we could do this with shortest path by holding Control, clicking, and then still holding Control, clicking here, and it will select all of these along this path. This is another instance where selection order absolutely matters because Blender will always perform the shortest path operation from the active face, which is highlighted in green here. So if I hold Control with this still active and click out, it will grow the selection from that active green triangle. So if I wanted to grow it this way, I wouldn't be able to do that because this face would need to be the active face. To make this the active face, we can press Shift, click to deselect it, and then click again, still holding Shift to reselect it as the active face. Remember that the last selection you make will always be the active face. So now, if we Control and then click, we can grow the selection that way. So now that we know how to select individual portions of our mesh, we can use the same transformation tools that we used in the last video to change the shapes of these primitive objects. So, using the selection tools we just learned, we're going to make a selection, and we can hit G to grab and move around and move. We can press R to rotate our selection, and we can press S to scale it. Now you may notice if you have a single vertex selected that you can grab and move it, but scale and rotate will have no effect. This is simply because a vertex is a single point in space, and by definition, a single point in space cannot have the properties of scale or rotation. It is reflected here in the sidebar panel, which again, if it is collapsed, we can press N to bring it up. For this vertex selection, it only has a location property. If you select an edge, you'll see that you can rotate and scale it as well as move it. The same is true for faces. We can move by pressing G. We can rotate by pressing R. We can scale by pressing S. So let's use these transformation tools. Rather than undoing through that, I'm just going to add a new sphere. So starting from a default sphere, we'll press Tab to go into edit mode. Let's go into vertex selection mode by pressing this icon. So now we're going to use these transformation tools to change the shape of this. And we're going to change it from a sphere to more of a teardrop. So I'm going to go press 1 on the numpad to go into front orthographic view. I'm going to press G to grab this vertex, and I'm going to press Z to transform it along the Z axis only. So again, that's G, Z. We're going to move it up, and we're going to click to place it. So next we're going to select this entire loop going down. We can do that by holding Alt and selecting between these 2 points along this loop to select the whole loop. Pressing 1 to go into front view, pressing G, Z, we can move it up. And by pressing S, we can scale it in. Now we're just going to repeat this process with all these loops until we have changed it into a teardrop shape. Okay, that looks pretty good. You may notice me move in and out of edit mode quite a bit while I'm modeling something. I'm just trying to check the silhouette of the shape, which I find is a lot easier to do when the vertices aren't being drawn over it. It just throws off my eye a little. So the tab shortcut, as you can see, will be extremely useful in quickly getting in and out of edit mode. So there is another way to achieve this shape with fewer steps, but slightly less fine-tuned control. And that is with what is called proportional editing. So let's move this off to the side for now, just by hitting G and pressing X and moving it over. And we're going to add another sphere right here. Shift A, Mesh, UV sphere. So tab into edit mode. We're going to select just this top vertex, the same way we did with this last one. And this time, we're going to turn on proportional editing by pressing O on the keyboard. And this little icon here will light up to tell you that proportional editing is now on. And we can always toggle proportional editing on and off by clicking the icon itself. So with that on, we're going to go into front view by pressing 1 on the numpad. Frame this up. We're going to press G and Z the exact same way we did before, but you'll see now that we have this black circle drawn around our selection, and when we move it up to about the same point, we're dragging these loops along with us in a way that sort of has a fall off, in which the farther away you get from this selection, the less these vertices are going to be influenced by this transformation. So Control Z to undo, hit G and then Z for the axis. This black ring is the influence radius. So we can change it and effectively change the shape we are creating by, before we click to confirm the placement of this while it's still under our cursor, we can scroll the mouse wheel up to increase the influence or scroll it down to decrease it. Scrolling it all the way down effectively makes it the same as having proportional editing off. So we can scroll till we find a shape that's relatively close. We can click to confirm. We can press O to turn off proportional editing. And now we can scale these loops by holding Alt, clicking between these, pressing S, and scaling them in until we have roughly the shape that we want. Now, the difference between this method and this method may seem somewhat arbitrary at this point, but you'll see that there are going to be times when you're going to want to move something in a way that just feels a little bit more organic, as if you were pushing or pulling bits of clay, and proportional editing is a really great tool for that. Let's keep this one. I like this shape a little better. So I think this is a good time to mention something about the pivot point, which is known in Blender also as the origin. So I may use terms pivot and origin interchangeably here. Now, we've discussed it before, but I want to bring it up again because you might have noticed now that when we move things in object mode, our origin is moving along with our mesh. However, if we tab into edit mode, and say we have everything selected, and we can do that by pressing A on the keyboard. If we now move our mesh around, the origin remains where it is. This is because this mesh is essentially parented to this origin. So when you move a mesh in object mode, what you're really moving is the origin, and the mesh is sort of just following along with it. However, when you move something in edit mode, you're moving all these points individually relative to this point here. So by changing the relative location of this mesh to its origin, that is one method of moving your pivot point. So let me show you what I mean by that. In front orthographic view, press 1 on the numpad if you are not in it already. We can move the pivot of this object. So right now, if we rotate it, this is what it looks like rotating around the origin at the center. And if I were to move this object in object mode, it would still rotate that way. Now, however, if we start with this object in the center, we can do that by pressing Alt-G to clear the location. If we tab first into edit mode, and then press G, and then press Z to move it up slightly so it looks like it's sitting on this red line, which this will serve as our ground plane. But in edit mode, we've moved it now. So if we tab out, we'll see that the origin is now at the bottom of the object. And now when we rotate, it will behave completely differently. So why does this matter? Well, in a more practical example, let's say you're making an animation, and in your scene you have a character and they need to move through a doorway, to open a door. Well, let's make a door very quickly. We're just going to add a cube by pressing Shift-A, Mesh, and selecting Cube. We're going to scale it in the Y direction by pressing S and then Y and scaling it in. We're going to scale it in the X direction, S, X, and that is roughly a door shape. So let's press 1 to go into front orthographic. So let's say that this X-axis line is our floor, and this blue Z-axis line is going to represent where the hinges of our door would be. So if we move this into place, rotate around it, so it should swing open like this. But currently, its origin is at the center. So when I press R to rotate and Z to rotate around the Z-axis, that is sort of a problem. So let's clear the location by pressing Alt and G. Let's go press 1 to go into front orthographic view, and let's tab into edit mode before we move this object. So with everything selected, which it should be by default, but if it is not, just press A for all, press G, and let's scooch it up so that the corner lines up with the ground plane and the edge where the hinges should be. Now let's press Tab to go back into object mode. Now when we select this and press R and Z to rotate it, you can see it is rotating in a much more door-like fashion. One more thing to note is that your mesh will always scale away from your pivot point. So up until this point, because we have not moved our pivots, they're always start by default at the center of the primitive. So when we scale it, it scales from the center equally in all directions. But now with our pivot offset from the center, when we press S to scale this object, you can see that it is scaling directionally. This can be really useful. Now, the only caveat to moving the pivot this way is that it is not always the most precise. If we zoom way in on this, you can see that the origin is not exactly on our mesh. Our door is actually floating a little bit above it. Now, we can get this origin exactly onto our mesh if we need it, if we need to be really precise. You can do this with snapping. So, in edit mode, I'm actually going to move this a little bit farther away from the origin just so it's more apparent what I'm doing. So in edit mode, we want to select this edge. We can do that by box selecting both vertices, selecting it in edge mode, or if we are in wireframe and in the front view, we can box select this vertex, which will select also the vertex behind it. Once you have this edge selected, you can hold Shift and S to bring up the snapping menu, and we're going to select Cursor to Selected. This has snapped our 3D cursor exactly onto this edge, at exactly the halfway point between these two vertices. From here, we're going to press Tab to return to object mode. And with this object highlighted, we are going to right-click to bring up the Object Context menu. Now, we used this before when we were shading things both smooth and flat. But this time, we're going to go down here to where it says Set Origin, and we are going to select Origin to 3D Cursor. This has snapped the dot that appeared here onto exactly this point, which, because we have snapped the cursor, is exactly along this edge. Now, under the Set Origin menu, again, right-click, Set Origin, we have a couple of other ways we can snap our origin. We can do Origin to Geometry, which will find the center point of this mesh and snap it to that. Or just Control-Zing to get this origin back at the world center. We can set origin, geometry to origin, and that will snap the center point of our mesh to wherever the origin is in world space. So again, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. So if we have this snapped onto this edge, we can now select this and press Alt G to clear the location, and instead of clearing it so that the center point is on the world origin, this snapped the origin of the object onto the world origin, which gives this object a location of 0, 0, 0, despite not coming from the center. Now, the pivot can also be temporarily affected without moving this origin point, and that is going to be by using the Transform Pivot Point drop-down menu. Now, it's more apparent what this does with multiple objects in the scene. So I'm going to select this, and I'm going to press X to delete it. I'm going to reset the location of my 3D cursor by holding Shift and pressing C. This will just snap it back to the exact origin of the world. I'm going to add a new object, and it doesn't matter which one. Let's do a cone. We don't work with cones very often. I'm going to bring this cone up by pressing G and then Z and moving it up. I'm going to press G and X and move it over to the left. Now I'm going to duplicate the cone, Shift, D, and then X, and then click. So now I have these two objects side by side. Now, if I select both of these either by shift clicking or by dragging out a selection, and I press scale or rotate, you will see a dotted line being drawn from my cursor to the center of these two objects. This is because we are in median point mode for the transform pivot point. So despite the fact that individually these objects would move around their individual origins, when we have them both selected, because this selection mode is at median point, Blender is looking at everything you have selected in the scene, finding the center of those objects in space, and using that as the pivot point. We can change this by coming to the drop-down, selecting individual origins, and now when we rotate or scale these objects, they are each rotating and scaling around their respective origins. The rest of these options are pretty self-explanatory, but try them out at your leisure. Active element will scale and rotate around whichever one is highlighted in the green here, whichever your last selected object is. And 3D cursor will rotate and scale around the 3D cursor, which right now is between them, but if you move them out, you can see it rotates and it scales using this as the pivot. So for the next exercise, I want you to use the skills that we've just gone over to make something. So starting from primitive objects, tabbing into edit mode, and moving and transforming the vertices, edges, and faces to make a new shape out of these primitives. I'm going to be doing a demonstration, which you can either follow along and make the same thing I'm making, or you can make something of your own creation. Either way, it doesn't matter, as long as you are using these skills of transforming vertices, edges, and faces in edit mode, and ideally layering those skills on top of the object level transform skills that we learned in the last lesson. In the next video, we are going to cover some mesh operations that will allow us to add vertices, edges, and faces to these shapes so that we are not limited to using only the ones that are existing, which I believe on a default sphere is 482. I believe it's 482 vertices on a single object. We're going to need more information than that. But for now, we're just going to practice using the transform operations on the edit mode level. So let us get started with the demonstration.